Well, I'm here with my friends in Providence, Rhode Island, and we're at Kate Colby's house. Kate, thank you so much.
Thanks for coming.
And Laynie Browne has joined us.
Happy to be
and
here.
And Leanne Browne, unrelated, has joined us. And Anna, hi.
Hello.
And we're here to talk about a poem by Rosmarie Waldrop. And it comes from a book that was published by New Directions called Blind Sight. And in this book is a section of poems called Cornell Boxes. And so Joseph Cornell, anybody want to, what did he make? Leanne?
Well, actually, I teach on Utopia Parkway in Queens, so I always teach about Joseph Cornell's boxes, where he did these collage boxes, where we make these sort of interior worlds. A lot of times they have little childhood objects or just these great collage worlds within a box.
Right.
Yeah.
So they're little box collages with things in them. And so Rosmarie is doing the poem equivalent of that. One is called Enigma Box. There's another one called Ice Box, Star Box, Letter Box, Cinder Box, Box Camera Box, and Toolbox. And there's another one called Jack in the Box, which we're going to talk about. And Jack in the Box is in memory of John Hawkes, Jack, known to his friends, a Providence-based, Browne University-based experimental novelist who was absolutely all the rage. I believe The Second Skin is 1964. The Blood Orange is maybe early 70s. These are like really famous books. And Rosmarie Waldrop, also in Providence, also affiliated with Browne, was friends with Hawkes. So I'll read this and then we'll talk about it. The enemies of the novel are plot, character, setting, and theme, you said. But the Marquise, is that how I pronounce that? The Marquise, still goes out at 5. And at the stern, where we were standing together but separated, it was impossible to hear the engines of the ship. The alternatives of free, footnote, CF, fail, hold, lance, wheeling, dom for all, free will, and causal determination do not exclude each other, though problems arise if we look for truth where definitions are needed. I heard the sudden hiss of urine. First through glass, you said, her legs straddling the railing, underclothes ravaged from an invisible clothesline, pollen, hollows of the body, such tension. Everything is dangerous, you said, everything tentative, nothing certain, life jackets gulfed by cross currents, the thrashing of the great blades just below us in innocence in extremis. There would be contradiction only if a man could see through himself, footnote 2, and smoke 5 Dutch cigars, which is as impossible as knowing if a measuring rod retains its length when taken to another planet. Suppose instead we enter a period of midriffs, of second skins. Ya, you said quickly, the I, bodily, the despotism of the uterine, odorous, earthen, vulval, convolvacious, saline, mutable, seductive. Can you rivet your eyes on the close by? Footnote 3, a single fly buzzing. We asked, and yet turn them toward hemisphere distances. Can you crowd a spare sentence with absence and spare it? The question whether causality applies to actions of your own will is a travesty as pure and dark as a blackened negative. It's dreadful. Dreadful no one has yet seen a wavelength. Of speech or suffocation, you said, white cadences, cold fire, hair like a dense, furry tongue, natural lace, beetle leg, scar, a field of blood. The enemy of pleasure, you said, is the curve of probability and flat exit. And so science must acknowledge singing in the wake of pubic darkness. A different geometry would obtain if we had rigid bodies. No turning back of time. You, footnote 4, knife, daw, rabbit, straws, a lantern, in the pulpit, in the box. You said, unbearable sunlight, gunmetal ocean, Irish eye, glass splinters, a dream of flying and falling, a deep leap into, while the rest of us stand here stabbed with sorrow. Oh boy, there's so much going on. Laynie, where do you begin?
I think the first line, the enemies of the novel are plot, character, setting, and theme, you said. That's John Hawkes speaking.
Right.
And so...
And that would be something he would say because he's a sort of an anti-narrative novelist.
Right. And so my first question is, how does that statement relate to the method or the movement of this piece? Or how does this piece reflect that truth or statement?
Great. Who wants to go next? We have the Cornell box idea. We have Hawkes's experimental fiction, and then we have Rosmarie Waldrop doing her Cornell boxes in a certain thing, a certain mode, which is 4 stanzas, she called them, each with, and 4 sentences, each with 4 sentences, and each with 4 footnotes. So Anna, how are we putting this all together? She's making a Cornell box out of her colleague who has passed.
Yeah. I love the footnotes. I love the way the footnotes are working. They make they kind of constantly sort of draw you out of the paragraph. And I think I liked the way that you read it by pausing at the footnote and then reading the footnote so that you yourself had to do that action of sort of taking us out of the paragraph, bringing us to the footnote, and then diving back in. Certainly lots of other experimental novelists have used the footnote as a way to disrupt the typical reading experience.
Mm-hmm. Leanne, what do the footnotes do, if anything?
One thing I thought, especially the you and the footnote number 4, I'm not sure if that alludes to something in his own work, but it seems like those are objects in the box of the stanza that make a portrait of him. And the other thing I want to say, it's like a tissue of quotes too, a tissue of quotation from his work. It's very Rosemary poem, but it's also feels very different than her language. But there's a relationship.
Because we presume it's got a lot of Hawkes language in it, and if we were more up to speed on Hawkes's fiction, we might actually know where a lot of these phrases come from. We see
second skins.
They're all compound words, starting with Jack.
Exactly. Kate, Jackinthebox. What is a Jackinthebox? And it's a nice, fun thing she's doing.
It's
here.
a child's toy that you wind up and a puppet jumps out.
And each time it's delightful, even though you know it's going to happen.
It's terrifying too. And in this case, because this is an elegy and it ends how it does, I read it very darkly. That title is a coffin.
He's in his coffin, so that's the second. And the third is the Cornell box. So we have 3 Jacks in the box. And it's almost elegiac at the end, right? Mm-hmm. The rest of us stand here as if she's speaking this over his box. Kate, so the relationship between Hawkes's experimental fiction, which he tells us about through her in the first line, and also possibly the first line of the 4th stanza. So what do we do with that? Presumably this is a kind of an experimental aesthetic, and how is she responding to it? And is this, how does one express friendship with someone who's an experimental writer other than, doing it yourself?
Well, I can't speak to the last item, but I read these as collages. In visual art, a successful piece of art is one that balances contrasting elements, and it sort of seesaws back and forth between aleatory elements and what is scientifically fixed principles of physics. But then there's also this note of absurdity and sort of like humor regarding death, and then there's just the fact and sorrow of actual death itself, and it sort of folds in all of those things.
Thank you. Anna, 3rd stanza. Can you rivet your eyes on the close by, we asked, and yet turn them toward hemispheric distances? Can you crowd a spare sentence with absence and spare it? Can you try to translate that into plain English, that last part?
Can you crowd a spare sentence?
Yeah.
Well, there's the paradox of crowding something that's spare. So that would mean that there's a kind of open space that we're going to fill with absence. So perhaps the person who's died, in this case, Jack.
Okay, that's a good reading, but also, that's a really good reading, but also fiction is a filling.
Totally.
Fiction is making the presence out of an absence, right?
Any writing, I think, that seeks to do that is making a presence out of an absence. But fiction particularly, because you've got this blank page that you fill and fill and fill with words.
Yeah.
Unlike a poem where you might leave some blank space.
Mm. I sense a sentence-level aesthetic being established here through Hawks. But then the last part, Leanne, is a little fun and weird. Can you crowd a spare sentence with absence and spare it? It's a pun on spare,
Yeah, to
obviously.
spare tire or spare something to save it, to spare it from being killed or from death.
Or like sparing a nickel, like afford it.
As in, can you spare a nickel?
It also seems like there's another layer. So if there's presence replacing absence, there's also a surprise. Like we think there's an absence in a box, and then the Jack in the Box jumps out of the box in the way that meaning is magnified and multiplied throughout. Like with the footnotes is one example, but if there's a presence replacing an absence, then there's also an attempt to write the absence.
Interesting. There's another figure that I really like here. It's as something is as impossible, so it's a simile, is as impossible as what? Knowing if a measuring rod retains its length when taken to another planet. What do you make of that? So something, there would be a contradiction only if a man could see through himself. And that man seeing through himself is as impossible as what?
Well,
It's really something.
one can know whether a measuring rod retains its length when taken to another planet.
Unless
if one
the people of that other planet have different measurements of length, plot, character, setting.
I can't quote it, but there's a ruler in the Law of Excluded Middle, too, where she says that it's almost like alluding to measuring a phallus.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's a lot of interesting things with the uterine and the cavities of the body that's like Law of Excluded Middle. But there's this
It talks about carrying a ruler in one's purse.
right?
But I interrupted you, Kate. You were no. Then we riffed on it. But back to Kate. You're thinking there might be an irony. It is not that impossible.
Well, yeah, what makes that sentence not inscrutable, that gnarly, is that one can know that thing if one is a physicist and knows the laws of nature. So it sort of involutes about 4 times, and then you don't know whether she's saying something is
That's how you crowd a spare
contradictory or
sentence.
not. Right.
Instead of an inch is an inch is an inch, and a foot is a foot is a foot, you have this crowded spare sentence in which a man seeing through himself is exactly as impossible as a measurement taken somewhere else and not being the same measure. That's crowding out a spare sentence. She's really good at it. I'm really curious, and maybe we'll start to wrap up here. I really love the first line. When Hawks was doing his thing, the, let's just say, post-war experimental U.S. novel was still having to fight the radical fight. There was still just plenty of space for straight plot, character, setting, theme in the American novel. Hawks was not alone, but he was one of the avatars of this. And she's really sort of quoting that propagandistic moment. The enemies of the novel are plot, character, setting, and theme. Assuming that Rosmarie Waldrop, even then when she met him, a little later in the 60s, when did they move to Providence? Late 69 or something like that. And Hawks was already here. one assumes that Rosmarie Waldrop was very sympathetic to a novelist being that experimental. So let's talk about that. It's not something we should take for granted that everybody listening to this discussion will know. I mean, avant-garde novels, plotless or nearly plotless, characterless, settingless, themeless. This is really like difficult. Is this piece affirming it, memorializing it, celebrating it, wondering whether it's going to hold up? What's her relationship? What's the speaker's relationship to that?
I think she's celebrating it, but she's also playing and prodding and making fun and doing her own associative thing, embedding surprising meaning in language so that we can't pin one simple reading on anything. But I think it's definitely a celebration.
Because this piece itself has no plot, character, setting. It has a character.
As an elegy, I think too that if it's saying the enemies of the novel, she's also talking about mortality, and then she shifts to the enemy of pleasure, is the curve of the probability and flat exit. So basically, death.
Flat exit is the hero at the end dies, which of course is what happens in this piece too.
Right.
Yeah, Leanne, what's your thought about this whole enemies of the novel thing? It's funny, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it's
So
she's putting it up front because it's very important to his aesthetic, and she's like she said, celebrating it, but I just keep thinking about this the ya part, but it might be Jack.
Oh, she's trying to say Jack.
So anyway, that's the character. Like it's popping out too. I don't know, but that sound. At first, I thought it was ja, like German, but I don't see him speaking German, so maybe I thought it was Jack. But I mean, the language is the character, right? I mean, language is the character and the plot and the setting and the theme. I mean, language is.
Yeah. Has anybody been able to make anything of the metaphors, or somewhat extended metaphor of the ship in the beginning? Our legs are straddling the railing. It was impossible to hear the engines of the ship. The sudden hit. Well, I don't know where the sudden hiss of urine comes in. I kept hearing burning deck.
Yeah.
Just to footnote that burning deck press is Keith and Rosmarie Waldrop's press.
Well, there's an element of.
Oh, and I'm sorry, they published John Hawkes. Burning Deck published John Hawkes.
Oh, they did.
I think one piece, a kind of a
It's named after the boy stood on the burning deck. That famous poem. Yeah.
Sorry.
Oh, I'm grasping at straws a little bit, but just and sort of a notion of this great chugging away underneath imperceptibly, but that's actually driving the motion. I don't know, and perhaps that's mortality, or perhaps it is strictures of plot and character.
Right. Yeah, that's great. Okay, final thoughts from each of you on this piece, Jackinthebox, the Cornell Boxes of Rosmarie Waldrop. What do you think? Anna, your final thought?
I want to go back to something Laynie was saying a minute ago about why the particular formal choices that she's made here are particularly well suited to Elegy. I think the way that she's pulling in lots of language taken from John Hawkes' work variously, and maybe conversations that they had. There's a lot of, you said in here. Taking a structure, yet messing around with it variously within that structure. It's 4 sections, 4 sentences, 4 footnotes, but beyond that, these sentences are paratactic. They don't follow from one another. They're drawn from lots of different sources. And then you get this ending that's so devastating, right? A deep leap into, while the rest of us stand here stabbed with sorrow, which really just brings home all of the real sadness of the elegy in a way that we sometimes don't experience in experimental elegies. So there's a nice kind of balance between the real human pain and the experimental work that this poem is doing.
Fantastic. Laynie, final thought?
I'm thinking about footnote 3. Can you rivet your eyes on the close by? And then we have a single fly buzzing, which makes me think about Emily Dickinson. I heard a fly buzz when I died. I don't know if that's
Oh, yeah.
just where
Yeah.
my brain goes, but more elegy and time strangeness.
Yeah, and time, toward the end in that very moving last sentence, no turning back of time, you said. So for a friend who has died, being remembered saying that you can't go back, it's very moving, and Dickinson helps that. Kate, final thought?
Oh, I was just thinking that homage as elegy is particularly moving to me, and how it sort of drops off at the end. The sort of, I used this word earlier, but the archness, the absurdity, and the bantering quality of it falls away, and then you're just
It really
left
does.
with the
Leanne?
sorrow.
I'm struck by just the visual accumulation of word objects throughout the poem. Just each one is, it has all these pile up of nouns in the footnotes and in each box. And I can just really, my mind wants to assemble these boxes visually. First I said we should make them, actually make these boxes, but I realized they're already here. They're already constructed,
Yeah.
in language.
Thank you. Well, I have two final thoughts. One is there's a paradox or contradiction in the experimental writer who dies. The experimental writer who's made a whole career out of plotlessness or things not going in the way they're supposed to go. I think some of you already said this, but the question whether causality applies to actions of your own will is a travesty. I mean, when someone who's made a living on narrative experiment expires, you think, well, that was a flat exit after all. And the second point I want to make is following what Kate was saying about the end. I do think it turns toward a very sorrowful, to use her word, elegiac tone. Hawks once said famously, everything I've written comes out of nightmare. And I think there's a little of that nightmare there, whether it's a sinking ship or something, gunmetal ocean, Irish eye, glass splinters, a dream, not a nightmare, but a dream of flying and falling. A deep leap into the grave, really, right? While the rest of us stand here above the grave, stabbed with sorrow. So I want to emphasize that. It's really kind of a beautiful elegy, doing a Cornell box as a way of memorializing someone who's an experimental artist. So, thank you all. This was fun.